The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Russia's attack on Ukraine began 8 months ago. Now there's growing talk of tactical nuclear weapons and even dirty bombs. Is it time to negotiate with Vladimir Putin? We'll debate that tonight. Then, author Donna Jackson Nakazawa is with us on her new book, Girls on the Brink, and why science is only now understanding the neurodevelopmental significance of adolescence. It's Tuesday, October 25th, and that's next on The Agenda. Daily reports out of Ukraine amply describe a country determined to fight to the bitter end. But Russia's President Vladimir Putin, with a nuclear arsenal and a thus far endless tolerance for military and civilian casualties, also seems determined. That's prompted a somewhat sticky debate to emerge in foreign policy circles, whether or not to negotiate with Putin for an end to this conflict. With us now for more on that, we're joined in Miami, Florida, by Medea Benjamin, author of the forthcoming book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. She's also co-founder of the peace group Code Pink. And our remaining guests all in Washington, D.C., starting with Mark Kansian, retired colonel in the United States Marine Corps Reserves and a senior advisor in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Melinda Herring, deputy director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and George Beebe, Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's formerly a CIA Director of Russia Analysis. Thank you all for joining us on what is clearly a hugely important topic in our world these days. And to set things up, let us read an excerpt here from a piece from Washington Post columnist David Von Drehl, and it's titled, Why a Negotiated Peace with Putin is the Safest Way Out. Here we go. Readers angered by my position equate a settlement with Russian President Vladimir Putin to British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's 1938 Munich Agreement with Adolf Hitler. By this analogy, appeasement of Putin will only encourage him to invade more countries. But when folks tell me to remember 1938, I urge them to remember 2003. Saddam Hussein was a murderous, kleptocratic war criminal just like Putin. He boasted of his giant army just like Putin. And when he was toppled precipitously, we reaped a whirlwind of chaos. A similar chaos in nuclear-armed Russia is too dangerous to risk. Okay, let's get some feedback on this. Nearly 8 months into this war, is it time to start negotiating with Putin for a potential end to this war? George Beebe, start us off, please.
Yes, I think it is time to start negotiating with Putin on this. You know, President Biden a few weeks ago warned that we were on course toward a direct U.S.-Russian military conflict. He worried about what Putin might do if he's cornered. And I think he was right to worry about that. We're headed toward that kind of direct collision. And that's a very dangerous thing. And I think the only way you get out of that escalatory spiral is by talking. That's the way that Kennedy handled the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, almost exactly 60 years ago. And that's what I think we need to do today.
Melinda Herring, your view.
Steve, it's not time yet, and it's up to the Ukrainians. So George and I are longtime debate partners, and I have the same problem with his statement that I always have with his statements. Ukraine has agency, and Ukraine gets to decide when it wants to negotiate. And the Ukrainians are not interested in negotiating, and the Russians are not interested in negotiating at this point.
Medea Benjamin.
The Russians are certainly interested in negotiating. I think they're desperate to negotiate. And I think the U.S. has a lot to say in this because without U.S. weapons, the Ukrainians would not be able to put up this kind of fight. I think it's totally irresponsible that President Biden is not talking to Putin, that Secretary Blinken is not talking to Lavrov. The time is not only now, the time was long, many months ago. It should have happened before the war started, when the U.S. dismissed Russia's entreaty to negotiate, and it should happen immediately. Otherwise, we're in a lose-lose situation for the whole world.
Colonel Kansian.
Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be any common ground between the two sides. The Ukrainians want to reclaim all of their territory. Not surprisingly, the Russians haven't shown any indication of a willingness to withdraw. And once you start negotiations, you build an expectation that you're about to make a deal, that there's a deal on the table, you just have to find it. The only deal that you could make right now is an in-place ceasefire, and that gives Russia about 18% of Ukraine.
Okay, thank you for those statements. We now know where the four of you stand on this issue, and let's follow up. George, do you believe, I mean, I understand that you think we should be talking, but do you believe that there are the makings of a potential deal right now that both sides could sign on to?
Well, it depends on how you view the shape of some sort of deal. If you're talking about a territorial settlement where Ukraine and Russia agree on where the borders of Ukraine will be drawn, then no, there's no prospect of some sort of settlement on that anytime soon. That's a zero-sum deal. One side will win, one side will lose to some degree. And I don't think there's any interest on either side in finding that kind of a compromise right now. But that's not what we should be talking about. We need to be talking about the U.S.-Russian strategic relationship, how we each can avoid a head-on military collision that has potentially catastrophic implications for everyone involved in this, including the entire world. That's something that Ukraine doesn't get to decide. We should not be outsourcing American national security to Kiev. The United States and Russia need to be talking about how we handle that issue. And that's something that I think can be done. I think the Russians want to talk about that. And the question of where Ukraine's borders are going to be delineated can be handled over time, over a long time. That's how the Baltic states were handled during the Cold War. The United States never recognized the incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. We never have to recognize Russian annexation of any Ukrainian territory.
Okay, let me get some feedback. Let's get some feedback from some of the other guests on that position. Melinda Herring, okay, they're not going to agree on borders, but talks should still be had because of the broader U.S.-Russian geostrategic potential partnership. What do you say to that?
So, Steve, the White House is talking to Moscow. It is false to say that they're not talking. Biden has been very, very clear about nuclear weapons. He said that there will be catastrophic consequences if they're used. And the White House has told the Kremlin what we will do if Vladimir Putin uses nuclear weapons, and he's been very, very clear about that. So it's false to say that we are not talking. George is playing my favorite game. He's trying to distract us with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons and a peace deal are two very different things. I think the nuclear threat is serious, but I would assess it at a 5% chance. George would probably assess it higher. I won't put words in his mouth. But I think the White House has done a very good job of taking the threat seriously. Bottom line, Putin's not going to use nukes, and I'm glad to explain why.
All right. Before I get the other two guests in, I should give George a chance to respond to that. George, are you sort of baiting and switching here by having us watch the nuclear situation with ultra focus to the exclusion of the other issues which we ought to be focused on?
Well, I think the great lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as Kennedy put it, was that the leaders of nuclear superpowers shouldn't corner each other. They shouldn't put them in a situation where they have to choose between humiliation and nuclear war. That's the direction that things are heading right now. The notion that if cornered, Putin will not use nuclear weapons is an enormously reckless bet, in my opinion. That's an issue that the United States has to not only take seriously, we need to actually reach an understanding with the Russians, not just warn them that if they use nuclear weapons, that catastrophic consequences will follow. The Russians already know that. But if they believe the alternative to that is defeat, perhaps the breakup of Russia, utter humiliation in the world, then they may make that choice nonetheless. And that's very much not in our interest to test.
All right, Medea Benjamin, let me get you to react to this quote from President Zelenskyy, who has said, Ukraine will not hold any negotiations with Russia as long as Putin is the president of the Russian Federation. And my question for you is that a wise position for him to hold?
No, it's a terrible position, and he is only holding that position because he's getting endless amounts of weapons coming in from the US and from other countries around the world. It's also a bad position for the Ukrainian people because it means this war will drag on and more Ukrainians will be killed. There is no military solution to this conflict. It's going to end at the negotiating table, and I would say that there will be some decision at some point about where those lines will be drawn in the Donbass and setting times for internationally supervised referendum in Crimea. This will happen. The question is, will it happen in the coming months? Will it happen in the coming years? And will we be lucky enough to avoid a nuclear war? So I think we should all be hoping that there are negotiations. And Melinda, I hate to say it, but President Biden himself says he will not negotiate. He even says that he won't meet with Putin at the upcoming meeting of the G20 when they'll be together. So maybe there are obviously Secretary of Defense Austin has said he had been meeting, but that's not about solving the problem. That's not about peace talks, and that's what we need right now.
All right, I'll get Melinda to react to that in a second, but we haven't heard from Mark Cancian in a bit, and I'd like to get him to react, if you would, Colonel, to the notion that as long as Putin's in the chair, Zelenskyy will refuse to negotiate with Russia. Is that a wise position to hold?
I think Zelensky's position is that he wants to liberate all of Ukraine, and that's not an unreasonable position. And I think that as long as he and the Ukrainian people are willing to keep fighting to achieve that end, I think we should support them. An independent Ukraine, a democratic Ukraine, is important for Europe. And I think pulling our support out and letting perhaps the regime collapse is not in our interest. We've seen what happened in Afghanistan, and then, of course, before that in Vietnam. I think that the risks are low, and the upside is high for both us and the Ukrainian people.
Melinda Herring, can I get you on that?
Sure. So again, we need to be talking about what Ukrainians want. Ukrainians are the victims and Russia is the aggressor. In both of the two commentators' opinions, I hear them saying that we've pushed Russia into a corner as though Russia is innocent. Russia is the aggressor and Kiev is the victim. We haven't talked about what Vladimir Putin has done in Bucha or Irpin or Izum. There's massive war crimes in all of these places, and that needs to be addressed. 86% of Ukrainians want to continue to fight. The Ukrainians get to determine when it's time to sit down at the negotiating table, not Washington, not Moscow.
In which case, follow up, Melinda, if you would, with what does Ukraine need from the West right now, particularly with winter approaching?
That's a great question, Steve. So they need continued weapons. In particular, they need long-range artillery, and they need ATACMS. And the White House has said that it will not provide this. These are the long-range rocket systems that Kiev has been begging for a long time. They need armored vehicles, they need tanks, they need planes. But the White House has said multiple times we're not going to provide some of these additional weapons. If you ask me to grade, I'm not familiar with the Canadian system. We have an A to F system in the U.S. On an American system, scale, I would give him a B in terms of what we're providing. But it's not just weapons; it's also money. So Ukraine needs $5 to $6 billion with a B every month in budgetary support for the state to survive. And the United States is giving about $1.5 billion a month, and the EU has promised $9 billion, but they've only sent one of the 9. So the EU, the German finance minister, needs to sign off on the documents as soon as possible, so that Ukraine is not a failed state. Its banking system works. It's paying pensions and teachers on time. But that's partly as a result of the financial support that it's receiving from the West.
Mark Cancian, what do you think Ukraine needs at this moment from the West?
I think continuing the flow of munitions and weapons that we've been providing is the right thing to do. They've allowed the Ukrainians to stay in the field, to build up their forces, and now they've turned the tide. I'm very reluctant, though, to give them the long-range systems like ATACMS. Putin has drawn 2 red lines. One is no NATO troops in Ukraine, and the other one is no Ukrainian troops in the Russian homeland. And I would worry that this would constitute an escalation. The only targets that they really need with ATACMS would be in Crimea, and I think there are other ways to get at those targets.
Medea, I'm just wondering whether your deep concern about the status of this war extends to perhaps the United States government and, by broader extension, the West, starting to turn the taps off on Ukraine in order potentially to precipitate a faster end to this thing. What would you think if they were to do that?
Yes, I think we have to ask how long the American people and the people of Western Europe want to keep fueling this war. And I think we're starting to see that not much longer. The U.S. is now considering another $50 billion. The winter is setting on in Europe, where people are going to be screaming about the costs of paying their energy bills. The cost of food has gone up all over the world. And while Melinda talks about what Ukraine needs, I would like to talk about what Somalia needs, what Yemen needs, what Afghanistan needs, where people are dying. They need support. And so I think the world is saying we want the sides to all come to the table, because this is not just affecting Ukrainians, this is affecting the entire world.
Let me get a quick comment from Melinda before I go back to George on the issue of, you know, the midterm elections are happening next month, and there's every possibility the Republicans will take over the House of Representatives, and if they do, it might be tougher for the United States to continue to supply arms and materiel to Ukraine in the way they are right now. There are a lot of Republicans who don't want to do it anymore. How concerned are you about that?
I'm not super concerned, Steve. I'm a little concerned, but I know that there's a very strong coalition that supports Ukraine in Congress. And I also see a lot of support all over America still. And I think that support is even stronger as a result of Ukraine's success with the counteroffensive. So worried, but not super worried.
Okay. I want to, George, return to your concern about the nuclear threat, because in 2019, you wrote a book called The Russia Trap: How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe. And I want to be clear, I want to make sure I understand whether you think we are, at the moment, in the midst of this spiral that you described in that book.
Yes, I think we are. We've treated this war for many years now as a deterrence problem, as something that if we only show that we're tough enough, that we're willing to take strong measures against, that the other side will sober up and back down. And the Russians have treated the situation the same way. Putin, I think, from the very start has believed that if he shows that he's willing to be tough enough, willing to be brutal enough, willing to use Russian capabilities on the battlefield, that will sober up, that will sue for peace. What's happened, I think, at every stage in this war is that each escalatory step has prompted the other side to up the ante in turn. And this is producing an action-reaction cycle that is heading toward a direct U.S.-Russian military confrontation with extraordinary dangers that would come with that. So the only way you get out of that kind of cycle is not by saying, hey, we're going to stand up to you like we stood up to Hitler, or the way we should have stood up to Hitler in 1938. The only way you get out of that cycle is to treat this like the Cuban Missile Crisis, to talk about how you can find a compromise that doesn't sacrifice Ukrainian security or independence, that doesn't deprive Ukraine of its ability to defend itself, but secures that while at the same time making sure that we don't continue to escalate. That's how we have to do this. You don't do that by cutting off the Ukrainians of support. You do that by pairing that support for Ukraine's self-defense with a diplomatic track that finds an off-ramp from this escalatory spiral that we're in.
All right, let's remind everybody what Vladimir Putin had to say about the possibility of using nuclear weapons. This is him from last month. Sheldon, our director, could you roll that clip, please?
This is not a bluff. The citizens of Russia can be sure that the territorial integrity of our homeland, our independence, and freedom will be ensured. And those who try to blackmail us with nuclear weapons should know that the prevailing winds can turn in their direction.
Mark Kansian, how concerned are you that this conflict could go nuclear?
Well, frankly, Two things. First, it's very irresponsible to rattle your nuclear saber. Of course, Putin's been doing that since the beginning of the war. And whenever nuclear powers do that, of course, it's dangerous and irresponsible. Having said that, I don't think the chances are very high. In fact, I think the chances, fortunately, are very low. Putin has drawn the two red lines. One is about NATO troops, and the other one is about incursion into the Russian homeland, as he laid out. And NATO has respected those two red lines. In return, NATO has put down its own red line, no strikes on NATO territory. Putin has respected that red line. I think as long as each side respects the red lines, which they've been doing, then the dangers of escalation are manageable.
Medea Benjamin, how high are your fears that this conflict could go nuclear?
Absolutely high. Right now, we're seeing nuclear war exercises carried out by Ukraine with by NATO with B-52 bombers flying over the Black Sea. We're seeing the 101st Airborne practicing a war with Russia 3 miles from the Romanian-Russian border. I think this is escalating to a point where everybody should be concerned about it. It's kind of ironic that you hear people say, well, Putin's a madman, but he's just bluffing. Well, if he's a madman, then let's take him seriously and start negotiating. So I think in any event, this war is going in a way that's pointing to the use of nuclear weapons, and that's why the whole world needs an off-ramp.
Melinda, George just did bring up the issue of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, the 60th anniversary of which is being observed right now. And here's a line from President Kennedy from that time in which he said, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. How concerned are you that the West is in the process of doing that right now?
I have to say it again, Steve. Vladimir Putin has done this to himself. We are not the only actor in this situation. And I would say that Putin has a history of bluffing. He's made at least 3 dozen empty nuclear threats. So I don't believe him. And most people, including the U.S. government, don't believe that this is anything more than a threat. Vladimir Putin doesn't have very many good options. And I don't really think that there is an off-ramp for him at this point. I think he bet the house on Ukraine, and he's losing, and that's why he's grasping at straws and making these empty threats with nuclear weapons. But the thing that I'm really worried about, the realistic threat, is that Ukrainians are going to freeze this winter, and he's now attacking civilian infrastructure with impunity. So that's what I'm really worried about.
Do you think, though, Melinda, it's in our interests? Is it in the West's interest to ensure that Putin is not overly humiliated, because doing so will lead to worse consequences? That's the theory.
So I reject the premise that you've tried to put me in. I don't think it's one or the other, and I think that the likelihood of him using nuclear weapons is very low. If you make me give you a number, I say it's 5%. I think it's probably even lower. I've been asking all the nuclear experts in town, and they think it's very, very unlikely, because the United States has conveyed to Moscow what we will do in terms of a conventional response. That's not the only reason. The United States is not the only nuclear power in the world. Other nuclear powers that the Kremlin actually listens to, they don't care if we call and scold them, right? Let's be real. So they care about what India and China think. Other powers are calling Vladimir Putin and telling him to stand down. And the other reason he's not going to use nuclear weapons is that he knows his economy will be throttled if he does. His economy will look like North Korea. He'll have real sanctions and real problems if he uses nuclear weapons. And it's unclear that it will actually change anything on the battlefield as well.
George, let me ask you the can we walk and chew gum at the same time question, which is basically, can we avoid a humiliating retreat for Putin and support a war we believe is justified at the same time? Can we do both those things simultaneously?
Yes, we can, if our war aims are to make sure that Ukraine is not defeated, not re-subjugated to Russia. I think that's a very achievable goal, and we can achieve that without putting Putin in a corner where he has to choose between humiliating retreat and nuclear escalation. If we believe that Putin must be driven out of Crimea, that Russia must retreat altogether in a humiliating fashion, and that ultimately Putin needs to leave power, as some prominent Americans have suggested should be a goal, then no, I think we're actually, if those are our war aims, we're headed toward a direct U.S.-Russian military confrontation. And so we do have agency in this. We don't have to push Russia to the wall. We can protect Ukrainian security without going that far, and that's what I think we need to be aiming for.
Well, I guess, Colonel Kansian, the ultimate question at the end of the day is, do we think Vladimir Putin is ultimately a rational actor or not? And you watch this, you've talked to lots of people. What conclusion do you come to?
I have to say that he seems very rational. He's evil and has a world perspective that we thoroughly disagree with. But he's been very consistent from the beginning of his governance about wanting to rebuild greater Russia. Looking at the invasion of Ukraine, I think he badly miscalculated, but there were many, I think, rational elements to what he did. Again, evil, but rational. And I don't think we should be deterred because we're worried that he's some sort of madman and might do something crazy if we don't bend to his will.
George, evil but rational?
Well, I think he is a rational actor, but we need to be careful that we don't impose our own calculations of cost and benefits on Putin. If he believes that he actually faces a choice between Russia's survival, which he thinks would be threatened by a humiliating loss in Ukraine, and escalation, which he recognizes would be extraordinarily risky but may hold out some hope of averting defeat in Ukraine, then he may choose in a way that we consider reckless, but he thinks under the circumstances would be better than the alternative. And I don't think that we ought to push him into that kind of corner.
Okay, one of the things that a lot of people who do what you all do for a living have been doing is looking at previous conflicts that Russia has been engaged in under Putin's time, during Putin's time, and seeing whether there are lessons there that can be applied this time. And to that end, I want to read a quote here from an article written by a current member of parliament in the country of Georgia's parliament, Salome Samarashvili. And here's the quote. The 2008 Georgia War and the 2014 annexation of Crimea should have proven by now that appeasement only begets more aggression. The sole way for the West to secure peace is to maintain unity and support Ukraine. That means not giving in to Putin's nuclear threats, which smack of desperation, and not countenancing any short-term deals that help him create the illusion of victory. Like a half-treated cancer, Russia will simply regroup and strike back even more aggressively if Putin is appeased, so says that Georgian member of parliament. Okay, let's get into this. Medea, do you have any concern that a negotiated settlement or ceasefire could potentially play into Putin's broader aims?
Well, in this whole discussion, we've never talked about the role of the West in creating the context for this. We haven't talked about the tremendous expansion of NATO, despite the promises not to. We haven't talked about the role that the U.S. and the West played in the 2014 coup in Maidan. We haven't talked about the failure of the Minsk agreements that the West also played a role in. And so I think when we look back at history, we have to recognize that we are to blame as well, that there are no good actors in this, and that as we move forward, to recognize that it is in our interests to have peace settlements that are actually enforced. If we had done that at the time of the Minsk II agreements, I don't think Russia would have invaded.
I hear you, but and George, let me pick this up with you. You know, there's a body of thought out there that says if there's a ceasefire that takes place right now, it will give Russia a chance to rearm, it will lead to more fighting, and it will not actually get the West closer to where it wants to go. What's your view on that?
Well, you know, this argument that striking some sort of compromise with the Russians would only encourage more Russian aggression, would only encourage the Russians to engage in further examples of nuclear blackmail, I think is belied by history. The United States and the Soviet Union compromised over Cuba. We agreed we weren't going to invade Cuba. We agreed that we would remove U.S. nuclear missiles from Turkey and from Italy. The Soviets in turn agreed they would remove missiles from Cuba. That did not lead to a new era of Soviet aggression. It did not lead to case after case of Soviet nuclear blackmail. In fact, it led to a new era of détente, of an era of arms control, confidence building measures, of understandings about where red lines were drawn that in fact protected stability in the Cold War period. So I reject this notion that appeasement is going to bring greater aggression. We can deal with that. We've done it during the Cold War. We can do it again today.
Melinda Herring, is a ceasefire a good idea?
Again, it's not on the table, Stephen. I wish it were, but it's not on the table. 86% of Ukrainians say they still want to fight. And time is not on Ukraine's side. Ukraine is winning right now and is making real progress in terms of the counteroffensive in the north, a little bit in the east, and some in the south. So they're going to push for the next 2 to 3 weeks until the temperatures really decline and it becomes more difficult to prosecute the war.
We're down to our last few minutes here, and Colonel Kansian, I guess I want to get a better understanding from you. I'm not sure when, but at some point this thing's going to end. How does it end in your view?
I can see a couple of endings. One possibility is that both sides get exhausted and there's some sort of ceasefire. The risk there, of course, is that that's just a temporary ceasefire. We saw that in Chechnya. The Russians did badly in the first Chechenian war. There was a ceasefire. They rebuilt the forces. They counterattacked and conquered Chechnya, put in their own strongman. There's some fair chance that the Ukrainians might actually push the Russians out, at least of Donbass and the areas that have been conquered, maybe not Crimea. I mean, we have to acknowledge that there's some also small chance that the Russians will further escalate and try to hang on to their holdings. Personally, I think that there'll be some sort of stalemate after the Ukrainians have reconquered some chunk of their territory.
Melinda, how does this thing end?
I think my colleague from CSI has just summarized it really brilliantly. We don't know. Ukraine has momentum right now, and if they can survive the winter, I think my colleague, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, is right. He says that Ukraine can be back at its pre-war borders, its February 23rd borders by the end of the year, and he thinks that Ukraine can retake Crimea next year. I think the Crimea piece gives me a lot of heartburn for a lot of reasons, and I think he's a little too bullish on that, but I think he's right that Ukraine can make a lot of progress in the next 3 months.
George, I'm down to my last minute and change here. How do you see this thing eventually coming to a conclusion?
Well, there are 3 possibilities. I think my colleagues have accurately summarized them. One is a stalemate, but that can be an unstable stalemate over time that leaves basically a bleeding wound in the center of Europe. That's not in anybody's interest, in my opinion. The second is a stalemate that leads to some sort of compromise, an actual understanding about what's in bounds and what's out of bounds that will allow Ukraine to rebuild and allow some stability in Europe and in the broader U.S.-Russian relationship. I think that's very much in our interest. And the third possibility is this escalates into a catastrophic U.S.-Russian military confrontation. I think we can avoid that with some wise diplomacy, but trying to prosecute this war until it is won unconditionally by Ukraine is a recipe for that escalation. So I think we need to be very sober about how we pursue this.
I'm afraid that's our time, but I'm very grateful to the 4 of you for having such a smart and civilized discussion with us on TVO tonight. Medea Benjamin, George Beebe, Mark Kansian, Melinda Herring. Thank you all very, very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In the past decade, the incidence of self-harm, eating disorders, and other serious mental health crises among teens, particularly girls, spiked across North America, alarmingly so in many cases. Journalist and author Donna Jackson Nakazawa translates complicated science at the intersection of immunology, neuroscience, and human emotion for non-experts. Her newest book does that with the emerging science on adolescence in the storm of modern life. It's called Girls on the Brink, helping our daughters thrive in an era of increased anxiety, depression, and social media. And Donna Jackson Nakazawa joins us now from Stevenson, Maryland, and it's so good to have you back on our program. Donna, how you doing these days?
Pleasure to be here. And like all of us, after the past 2.5 years, we're happy to be here, right?
Amen to that. Let me read
Amen.
this excerpt from your book just to set up our conversation. And Sheldon, if you would, let's bring up this graphic. Rates of depression in girls have now reached epidemic proportions. 1 out of 4 adolescent girls report suffering from symptoms of major depression, compared with fewer than 1 in 10 boys. Girls and young women are twice as likely as boys and young men to suffer from anxiety. These statistics cannot be explained by higher rates of awareness or diagnosis. They are real, and they are scary to every parent of every daughter and to anyone who cares about young women. You also later write that our modern adolescent female crisis in well-being is not just a psychological phenomenon, it is a biological one. You know, you got a daughter, I got a daughter. They're around the same age, so you can imagine I get your interest in this subject firsthand. But let's start with the last thing there. How is this also, in your judgment, a biological problem?
Well, it's interesting. And to set the stage for that, I want to point out to people, as somebody who's researched the intersection of stress and psychology across health and development, that it's only very recently that researchers even began to look at how stress in the environment affects the developing female brain. Prior to that, if you can believe it, like so many other areas of medicine, Steve, we were looking exclusively at a male research model. And guess what? It turns out that when you look at the intersection of stress across health and development in well-being for life, female biology actually plays a role in how stress is processed by the brain and how it affects development. So those of us who are reporters are not surprised by this, but I think that that's a really important place to start in our understanding that now that we are looking at female biology in the face of stress and how it affects the immune system and brain development, we're starting to see that it's giving us ways to connect the dots between the environment we live in, the stressors girls face, and this growing gap between the mental health of girls and boys.
Having said that, did you have some initial concern about probing the biological angle of this story?
Well, yeah, absolutely, because the fear is that if you start to talk about biological sex differences in any way, even if it's elucidating and helping us to understand how we can intervene and help girls in this time, it'll be misused, right? The way that so many aspects of female biology have been misused against women to, it used to be that a while ago, it was considered to be, hysteria that happened around a woman's period. And we've misused our understanding of biology in so many ways. And I certainly don't want to say anything that allows people to do that, because it turns out that in the absence of unmitigated, unrelenting stress, the female adolescent brain is a superpower. All of the things we're going to talk about today are just when those stressors become highly overwhelming.
Well, I mean, it has always been a thing, teenage angst, right? It has always been a thing. But what are girls facing today that makes it particularly different from past teenage angst?
Yeah, right. So, of course, all kids are struggling today. As we see these growing rates of anxiety and depression in girls, boys are facing other things, right? Boys are struggling too. We see more prevalence of attention disorders and behavioral disorders in boys. But all of our kids are facing this world that's coming in really hot and fast. The world is heating up environmentally, socially, emotionally. Gosh, Steve, 60% of kids in a recent Pew study said they fear that their school, here in the United States at least, will be the next site of a school shooting. And we've also kind of erased those middle childhood years between 7 and 13, the in-between years, which used to be about getting to know what you love and who your friends are and how to respond to the world around you. We've replaced that with this period of earlier and earlier competition. academically and socially and emotionally. So that has kind of erased those middle years of childhood at the same time that the world is coming in so hot and so fast. And guess what? The brain during these middle childhood years, these in-between years, it has not wired and fired up yet to handle this kind of outer competition and evaluation that's coming in at earlier and earlier ages. And that's true for all kids, right? But as I'm sure we'll talk about, for girls, the influx and the prevalence of social media in their lives is an added layer of, let's just say, toxicity.
Well, you've anticipated exactly where I wanted to go next, which is it seems that as soon as girls turn, I don't know what now, 10, 11, 12, the competition to get that cell phone, that fantastic new iPhone, is there. And I'm happy to blame social media for just about every ill in the world because it never fails to disappoint in being responsible for so many of them. Is it fair to do that, though?
I think that we want to put it in the context of all the other stressors that young people are facing. But when we begin to look at social media as a stressor, particularly in girls' lives, here's what we see. We see that girls are much more likely to spend more time on social media. We see that girls are rewarded for sexualizing themselves at increasingly early ages on social media. There's very, very little distinction between being a girl and being a woman on social media. And we also see that girls are much more likely to receive shaming, critiquing, being put down, especially by men, and that external evaluation about the face, the hair, the body, how they appear, what they say is much harder and faster on social media against females. And girls, when they receive this at this early age that you talked about, like we know that you aren't supposed to be on Instagram until 13, but Meta's own internal reports show that many girls are on by the age of 8, right? As you mentioned. So the brain is not wired and fired up to put this exterior shaming and evaluation and critiquing and this early sexualization and this performative quality in any kind of context at that stage of development.
Let me follow up on that from this standpoint. And I appreciate that you said in your book that you have a daughter, but it's her story to tell, and you don't want to go into too much detail there. And I kind of feel the same way with my daughter. I certainly remember a lot of this stuff, but I don't feel it's my place to tell. Having said that, I think it's fair to say that in my kids' experience, the girls were worse on social media than the boys. You got any empirical evidence that suggests that's the case across the board?
Well, what we see is actually both. We see that girls receive more critiquing and evaluative shaming from other girls and more shaming and evaluation for body, face, appearance, sexuality, and not living up to some mythical female idea from males. So girls get it from both directions.
Okay, let's go back to biology here. What is happening at puberty that can make girls more particularly susceptible to what we've been talking about here than boys?
Well, puberty is this wonderful golden time in development, right? It's when these amazing master regulatory hormones come in. And we think about those hormones, right, as things that we associate with the thrum of sexual excitement or mood changes. But really, estrogen, when it comes in, is this beautiful master regulator for the body and brain. It is helping those neurons in the brain to sing and fire together and helping the brain to wire up for resiliency in so many ways. But estrogen is also, across evolutionary time, what we call an immune amplifier. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it acts as an amplification system for the immune system in healthy and protective ways in females. It is the reason why women can do so much in smaller bodies and with smaller organs and still make room for a uterus, right? It's the reason why when we get vaccines, we have a more robust immune response. Unfortunately, in the face of too much stress, social, emotional, physical stress, it flips to what we call an evolutionary disadvantage. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it's the reason why women are more likely to develop autoimmune disease after puberty at 3 or 4 times the rate of men. It's the reason why women have more long COVID. So estrogen is this amplifier of our stress response, of our immune response. Yay, that's really good. It helps protect us and protect our ability to carry another life. But it is this disadvantage when the stressors are coming in, as we said earlier, too quickly, too many, too fast.
And what about early childhood trauma? Can puberty do something to make the consequences of that worse?
Absolutely. So across childhood, the brain's most important question is, am I safe in this world or am I not safe? Am I going to be safe as I go up and become a grown-up? One day I have to be out there on my own. If the answer to that question is not so safe, because intermittently you're not so safe, then the brain begins to wire and fire up based on that intel, right? Like a computer chess game that's taking into account every single move on that chessboard. The brain will begin to fire and wire up to be prepared for the next bad thing happening. And we don't want to see that, because when we see that, here's what it looks like in the brain. It looks like the over pruning of areas of the brain that we want to see fire up for resiliency in the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the hippocampus. And it looks like on brain scans, brain patterns we begin to see and associate with depression and anxiety.
It also seems, and you talk about this obviously in the book, that young girls are hitting puberty at an earlier age in life. What's the impact of that?
Well, gosh, Steve, in the 1800s, puberty was at 16, in 1900 at 15. Today it's happening at 11. And here's where we begin to see that intersection. So visually, we used to have adolescence would come in right before puberty. We wanted to see that, but now we're seeing puberty come in before adolescence. And what I mean by that is that adolescence, we talked about before, that period of the in-between years comes in between childhood and late adolescence, and the brain has a lot of experience in the world, how to handle things, how to respond to stressors. Is this a huge deal? Is it an emergency? Or is this something that, tomorrow will be okay again? And when puberty comes in and it amplifies that stress response in that big kind of way, that's a real problem, because again, the brain isn't wired and fired up to handle distress in that way, to even know, is this serious or not serious, to even know how to articulate what you're feeling internally, which has worked for all of us across the lifespan, or to even know how to ask for help, to recognize how I'm feeling is not okay. I need to ask mom and dad, what is this that's happening to me? I need some help here.
Well, now that we've completely terrified anybody who has a young girl who is on the verge of all of this, we know there are parents who are looking for advice to understand how to best handle the years to come in some cases, or if they're in the midst of it right now. So let's do that. Where should parents even begin as it relates to handling these issues?
Well, the first thing to remember is we're all doing our absolute best as parents. You're a parent, I'm a parent, I have 2 kids. We aren't going to do it perfectly, and that's okay. Just start where you are. So many times I have parents say to me, my daughter's already struggling, I messed this up or I'm not doing it right. And the truth is that when we begin to put in the 15 antidotes that all the experts that I ran around and agreed upon can really make a shift in girls' health and neurobiology and are neurobiologically protective. When we begin to put those in place, wherever we are, wherever we begin, it makes a profound shift in our relationship with our daughters and in their health and well-being and in their relationship with themselves and with this world.
Yeah, let's hit on some of those 15 antidotes that you just referenced, because you do spend half the book talking about that. And I guess, well, let's start here. Parents, you say, need to consider their own background, their own stress levels, their own past trauma as it relates to trying to deal with their daughters. Why is that important?
Absolutely. Well, we know that when we have a history of a lot of stress and trauma, and who among us doesn't at this point, and when we have a history of a lot of adversity and trauma over time, just as we talked about how stress and adversity can begin to affect health and development in young people, it is also true for us when we were growing up and when we were young, that a lot of adversity in childhood or chronic unpredictable stressors shifts our ability to regulate our own stress response. What do I mean by that? A really difficult moment comes up, maybe in family life, maybe you're standing in the kitchen, maybe you're in the living room, maybe you're driving your child in the car, and they tell you something or don't tell you something, and your stress response is going up because you know something is going on, you're worried. Well, when we've had a history of adversity, guess what happens when we face another potentially big stressor? We go into fight, flight, freeze, but we also lose our ability to think clearly and be the kind of parent we want to be in that moment. Our brain and our higher level thinking, we cannot access it in that moment. It just goes right out of our minds. So what we want to do is notice and get really discreet about noticing how we feel and how we respond in those moments of connection where our child needs us to be the very best parent that we can be. And if we find that we're caught up in kind of managing our own anxiety and distress and kind of bringing ourselves back to level playing field and grounding ourselves, and that we can't really be there for our child in a way that makes them feel safe and seen and known and valued, what we call technically parent-child attunement, then the work really begins with us, because that is what our children need in that moment, especially in this world that we're living in. They need to know that when they come to us, we see them, we are not going to be so caught up in fixing or being the detective or managing our own distress, that they can actually find that they are soothed for what they're going through in that moment. And that's where the work really begins for many of us as parents. And I raise my hand here as the very first among them.
Well, doesn't that just speak to being a good listener? I mean, at the end of the day, they just want to be heard, yes?
They just want to be heard, but they also want to know that they aren't just being heard, they're being heard in a way that we are stepping out of it with our needs and questions and evaluations. And that is really harder to do than it sounds. When I talk to parents, that is often one of the hardest things that they find in their parenting journey, to be that kind of parent who can support a child, particularly one who's struggling. Remember that all that we've talked about here tells us that it takes a while for a young person to even begin to know what they're feeling, to articulate what they're feeling. And as parents, we've spent our lifetimes, and reasonably so, being the fixer, right? Your kid falls down, you got to fix it, put a Band-Aid on it, get the Bactine. We are motivated to help our children from the moment we get up to the moment we go to bed. But in many ways, we have to take ourselves on another journey. And in the book, oh my gosh, I think I have over 100 scripts. Because when your brain flies offline, it can actually help you to rewire and refire your own brain as a parent by having scripts at hand. I've had parents tell me they're pasting them on the inside of their kitchen cabinets, or under the visor of the car, because it sounds really easy to do. But if you have ever really been worried about your child, as I have really been worried about my child, you will find in that moment that your best words are hard to find.
Do you have to be careful about running the risk of being overprotective and therefore denying your child the opportunity to develop skills of resiliency, which they will surely need throughout the course of their lives?
100%, because we know that during that period of development, we want to see the brain wire up, as you said, for resiliency. And it does that by meeting a little wobble in the world, right? We don't want to solve all our children's problems. We have to give them the time and the space and have conversations with them so that we can discern, is this a child-sized problem or is it an adult-sized problem that needs adult help? And that is a really important thing because we don't want to be like driving to school with a forgotten paper. We want to help kids realize they can deal with a lot of things on their own, right? We want their brain to wire and fire up for that sense of competence and a self-assuredness that, hey, if I make a mistake, I've made them before. I know what to do in this situation. It doesn't mean they aren't coming to you for advice, but you aren't taking over.
Donna, let's finish up on this. And again, I want to respect your privacy with your daughter in asking this question, but I wonder whether you have taken to heart and implemented yourself these antidotes that you've written about and whether they've always worked.
I would say that my short answer before I give a longer answer is that if only, Steve, if only this science, and if only I had done this reporting 10 years ago, I would feel, I wish, and I say in the book, I wish I had reported this before my daughter hit these really important years. And yet, I will add to that in my longer answer that honestly, it has made such a difference. It's made such a difference for how I am in the room with my daughter, even when she's facing really, really hard things. And I'll throw in one statistic here. One of the studies I report on in the book shows that the greatest, most significant factor of flourishing across these difficult years is one thing. Can this child come and talk to you about anything, no matter how difficult? And you know what? The 15 antidotes in this book, they're about that, but they're also about knowing sometimes that maybe you aren't enough and you have to bring in the wider world.
Wonderful. Donna Jackson Nakazawa. Her latest is Girls on the Brink, helping our daughters thrive in an era of increased anxiety, depression, and social media. We're always so grateful for your visits to our program, Donna. Until next time.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, October 25th, 2022. Would you take investment advice from someone on social media? Well, tomorrow we'll examine the world of so-called finfluencers. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.